All right, this is the Thursday, April 22nd meeting of the Assembly Judiciary Committee. I'm Mike Fewer. I'm the chair of the committee. We have one bill before us, AB 1639, jointly authored by Mr. Liu, Mr. Nava, and Ms. Bass. We, as usual, have a two-witness on each side rule, 2 minutes on each side, but of course we will have a thorough discussion of the legislation in addition to that. I would like to establish a quorum. I believe one member is in the hallway. Let's establish a quorum. Call the roll.
Here.
Here.
Fewer.
Here.
Tran. Brownlee. Evans. Hagman. Torlakson. Knight. Liu. Here. Monning. Here. Nava.
Here.
And Ms. Evans has joined us. We have 7 members and a quorum. Thank you for your patience. Now, let us hear the bill. Mr. Nava, you'll be presenting on behalf of the joint authors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Today I bring you Assembly Bill 1639, a bill that would create a foreclosure mediation resolution program following in the footsteps of at least 20 other states and local jurisdictions. First, I'd like to take as authors' amendments those listed on pages 8, 9, and 10. These amendments seek to address many of the issues that we heard in the Assembly Banking Committee to ensure the program is limited and targeted to those most in need and that the process will not be drawn out. I also want to express my thanks to the Judiciary Committee staff for their assistance. As of February 2010, only 168,708 homeowners have received final HAMP loan modifications, a small fraction of the 6 million borrowers who are presently 60-plus days delinquent on their loans. For every borrower who avoided foreclosure through HAMP last year, another 10 families lost their homes. When I was chair of the Assembly Banking Committee, I visited various communities up and down the state to talk to borrowers, housing counselors, and other groups to get a sense of the ongoing foreclosure problem. It became clear in my mind that many borrowers were falling through the cracks in spite of the efforts of the federal modification programs. In one meeting, I met with 50 families who traveled via bus overnight from Los Angeles to meet with me here in Sacramento and to tell their stories. Many of these homeowners had already lost their homes. Others were on the verge. Their common narrative was a story of ineffective and frustrating interactions with their servicers when seeking assistance. Their stories were not about a lack of modification, but a lack of communication and clear guidance from the loan servicers. This bill seeks to address that issue by giving homeowners who may be delinquent or in the foreclosure process the right to request mediation with their servicer. Mediation as a dispute resolution option has a history of assisting in most complex cases and can avoid a costly court process or intense litigation. AB 1639 attempts to ensure that the homeowner and the servicer can work out a solution. The solution may not necessarily be a loan modification. For borrowers with no hope to stay in their homes, this process could serve to ease the blow of the foreclosure process by giving that homeowner a clear signal that they need to make arrangements to leave the home. This bill does not compel either party to a specific result. If the sessions do not lead to a mutually acceptable solution, then the foreclosure process continues as planned. I would consider this a success that comes about from other foreclosure prevention efforts that are helping borrowers before they need mediation, and that the program attracts borrowers who are in the most desperate need of help. We do not envision this as a solution to all borrowers. Those borrowers currently in active discussion with their servicers should continue as such. What this program is about is for borrowers who need the help and are facing unresponsive servicers for whatever the reason. Let me point out that we're certainly not out of the woods yet. Over the next 2 years, we face the adjustment of almost 1 million option arm loans, the majority of which are in California. This translates to almost $300 billion in mortgage loans nationwide. That's a punchy little tune. This problem is not going to go away anytime soon because the solutions may make us feel uncomfortable. Too often the foreclosure crisis is observed in the abstract, behind stacks of reports and foreclosure data that fails to put a face on the problem. The face of this crisis is our neighbors. It's teachers, firefighters, and workers all struggling to hang on to whatever is left of the American dream. In closing, I'm certainly remain open to work with all interested parties who wish to discuss this issue and further refine the solution.
Thank you, Mr. Nava. Do your witnesses also intend to set their testimony to music, or is that just going to be you to say?
I think there's a little special technique to that, and only certain people can pull
All
it
right.
off.
First witness in support.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Andrew Antwi here today on behalf of Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. We'd like to thank Assemblymember Nava, Assemblymember Liu, and Assemblymember Bass for agreeing to author this measure, not only on behalf of the residents of the city of Los Angeles, but the countless Californians who've watched their homes get foreclosed upon and wondered if there was one more thing they could have done to hold on to their properties. As Assemblymember Nava alluded to in his presentation, there is a program underway at the federal level to try and provide assistance to homeowners, and it focuses really on the modification process. Unfortunately, the success of this program has been marginal at best. We believe 1639 would provide a standardized process to make a third-party, neutral, independent mediator, as Assemblymember Nava mentioned, available to help assess whether or not modification is the best course of action for individual homeowners. In Los Angeles, the problem is particularly acute. In 2009, there were an estimated 2,600 foreclosures just within the city limits. Based on information that we've obtained from RealtyTrack, there could be more than 8,000 additional foreclosures this year. We think this could work in California. We've seen some evidence that this is working in other states. In a soon-to-be-released report from the Center for American Progress, the state of Connecticut, which calls for automatic mediations, we've seen that 80% sometimes are successful. In Philadelphia, which pioneered mediation, 70% of the cases that were closed with assistance of the city's legal aid organizations resulted in borrowers staying in their homes. And finally, in Cleveland, they report that mediation settlement rate is roughly 50%. All of these results point to the fact that we should at least be trying this in California, and it should be part of the toolkit. So we ask for your support.
Thank you. Next witness in support, please.
What order do you want them in? Okay. Usted, señor?
Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard Sarati, and I'm the president of a committee called Save Our Homes in the LA County. We're under Hermandad Mexicana in Panorama City. Back in 1995, my wife and I were fortunate enough to gather some money and put down on our current home. At that time, the price was $265,000. In 2006, the property, as you know, went pretty high in property value, and my wife and I, we needed some money to upgrade the property, so we took out a loan. We didn't know that it was a subprime loan, and it was a fix for 2 years. In 2008, we got a letter from Litton Loan Servicing that the APR percentage rate was 9.75, which made my payment close to $5,400. And although I'm a retired military and also a Social Security pensioner, it's very, very, very hard for me to make that payment, even though I have my son-in-laws, and they're helping me out with part of the payment. And I tried to get a modification from Litton Loan, Litton Loan Servicing, and they put me on a 3-month trial payment. Then on January 2009, I got a letter indicating that my modification had been canceled due to the fact that one of the payments, September payment of 2009, was late, which is not true. I always send my payments via Western Union Quick Pay, and I kept asking them to please consider me for a modification, and they keep dragging their feet, and they're very rude and very unjust. They keep saying that I don't have no options, that the only option is for a short sale, and that property means a lot because I have my grandkids, and we live very happy years there, and I have a fixed income. I mean, I have a steady income. I can make the payment, but not $5,400. If I make that payment, in fact, on the 1st of May, I have to come up with a 5127 payment, and I'm saving for it. And the reason I'm saving is because I don't want the property to go in foreclosure. I want to please consider. I want Lytton to consider my modification, and if they can just lower my interest rate, I will be able to make the payment. And please, I'm asking you to consider that. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much for coming and for your testimony. The committee appreciates it very much. Let's proceed to the next witness in support, please.
Mi nombre es Blanca Ordóñez.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Araceli Campo with Assemblymember Caballero's office. I'm going to be translating for Mr. Nava's witness.
Thank you for your service, but I do want to note that the committee has a policy of 2 witnesses on each side for 2 minutes each. We've now heard from those 2 witnesses. So I'll tell you what, I will allow very brief testimony, but that also will lead me to allow additional testimony by the opposition to assure fairness. Briefly, please.
Yo en mi banco que era Licton, hice una modificación, el banco me la aceptó, mi nombre es Blanca Ordóñez.
So the lady's name is Blanca Ordóñez, and she had Lipton Bank as well.
Hice una modificación, el banco me la aceptó, me mandó los primeros 3 pagos que tenía que hacer.
She had signed up for a modification for her loan and had received the confirmation from the bank that there had been a loan modification agreement.
Cuando el banco vendió la casa en una subasta.
Okay, and then the bank ended up selling her home at auction. And Mr. Chair and members, just for brevity, we met earlier with these families. Like her, there's about 3 other families here. Just to kind of wrap up, since I know for time, what we wanted to point out was that in all of the cases with the families, they had originally purchased fixed mortgages. They, after a couple of years, were led to believe that subprime or adjustable mortgages were in their best interest by third parties. They ended up being basically given or led to believe that the way for them to work with their banks was for them to stop making payments on their mortgages. And so for a lot of these families, that was the case, that there was a lot of, unfortunately, misinformation that was put out there. A lot of them ended up being victimized by third parties and promoters offering them a way out. Many ended up paying over, I think, $10,000, $20,000 going into debt.
Thank you very much. I think the committee, first, I fully understand when people travel a distance to be here, and I respect that very much. I appreciate your role as both translator and explainer in this situation. But now let us proceed to additional witnesses, identification and position only, please. Other witnesses here in support.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members, Donna Brownsey representing the California Dispute Resolution Council, which is an organization of alternative dispute resolution providers and members throughout the state. Here in support, we wanted to thank the author and his staff for working with us on the provisions specifically related to the alternative dispute resolution provisions in this bill. Also, the Committee Council has recommended several amendments in concept, and what we'd like to do is participate with the staff in terms of working out the language on those. We don't have any specific issues with respect to those.
Other witnesses in support.
My name is Frank Lower, and I'm here representing the Greenlining Institute, and essentially...
No, just identification, and you're here in support, is that correct?
Yes, I'm here in support of AB 1639.
Thank you very much.
And we are...
Sir, thank you. We are at the policy of the committee already has been deviated from, and we really need to adhere to some semblance of rules here. So thank you for your testimony and support. Other witnesses here in support. Please come forward and state your name and your position on the legislation.
My name is Carlos Alarcon, and my position on the legislation is that I would like to see it passed.
Thank you very much, sir. Other witnesses here in support? Okay, witnesses in opposition? And again, because I do want this to proceed fairly, I'll grant similar latitude to the opponents of the measure, which means essentially 2 principal witnesses in opposition and a 3rd witness can testify to a limited degree as well. First witness in opposition.
Mr. Chair and committee members, Kevin Gould with California Bankers Association. Just a few observations. I think it's hard to understand exactly where the bill is going based upon 23 proposed conceptual amendments, but I would just offer a few observations. Based on the testimonial from the first gentleman, some of the amendments would preclude him from going into the mediation session based upon the fact that he was previously offered a loan modification. So I don't know under those circumstances that particular gentleman would receive any assistance under this proposal. With respect to other folks who feel as though there may be fraud or coercion or steering, I think the lending industry has worked collaboratively with a number of the members from this legislature on solutions that deal with origination type issues. On those things where we can get to compromise, we've worked on subprime reform, higher price mortgage reform. We've worked on foreign language translation of origination documents. We've worked on reforms with respect to reverse mortgages and the subsequent sale of annuities. We've also worked on solutions that deal with borrower outreach before a notice of default can be filed. So I think where we have been able to find compromise, we've been willing to do that. And I think we've sent no less than 20 bills to the governor that he has signed on this particular issue. With respect to this bill, we're opposed to the concept. We think it's flawed. We think that in 19 of the other 20 jurisdictions, these were judicial foreclosure states, not a non-judicial foreclosure. So what we're trying to do is take what would typically be maybe a construct of a judicial foreclosure process and insert it into the non-judicial foreclosure process. The one state where this has been done is Nevada, and we think it's been a disaster. That program has been very expensive. It's been very cumbersome. It took a long time to get up and running, and we're fearful that same experience will happen here. The bill does not speak to what happens to the foreclosure process when and until that program is set up. So does it postpone all foreclosures until the state appoints and the governor selects an individual and the program is up and running? That question doesn't seem to be answered. We also would just say that I think some of the statistics we're seeing are different than what's been presented. The federal program that President Obama created last February has actually proven month over month to have increases in trial modifications offered, permanent modifications offered. The Office of Comptroller of the Currency and Office of Thrift Supervision have also showed market improvements with respect to non-foreclosure alternatives.
If you could please conclude your testimony.
So with that, we would just say that this bill is an enormous undertaking for the state. It's going to be very costly. We don't think it's necessary. We respectfully oppose the bill.
Thank you for your testimony. Next witness in opposition.
Mr. Chair and members, Mike Belote for the United Trustees Association and the California Mortgage Association. Again, I think we have a good faith disagreement with Assemblymember Nava and the other co-authors about whether this is really the right time and the right approach. In fact, the trustees are the people who conduct the non-judicial foreclosures, and in fact, notices of default and notices of sale and actual trustee sales are in decline. The system is responding to this situation, and it's not going to be right for every borrower, and we understand that. I spent last weekend at an event where I heard from people in the REO community talking about the Nevada experience. And Kevin talked about some of the difficulties there, but I understood that they've gone through repeated refinements to try to make that system work. They've had trouble finding mediators, qualifying mediators, and having trouble getting mediators to say that the process is done, you can proceed with the foreclosure. So the system, and this is just a disagreement, the Speaker of the Nevada Assembly came into this building last fall and explained how well the system was working. Well, I just heard literally this past weekend, all weekend, about all the difficulties there. We think there's going to be a big problem with California's volume getting this thing up and going in a way that is timely and anticipates the problems. You're going to have a problem with this. It's going to be expensive, and the system, however imperfectly, is responding. Foreclosures are down. Modifications are up. It is not time to put a mandatory mediation program in place, in our view. For that, we'd ask for a no vote.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to allow one more witness to speak briefly in opposition in addition to stating their name and their identification. So who's going to do that?
That would be me, sir.
Okay.
Melissa M. Alexson with the California Credit Union League, also opposed to the measure. Appreciate the staff's time on constructing some amendments that we've just seen. However, the credit unions in California remain concerned about the length of time of the foreclosure process. And for us that operate on a system of pooled money deposits, where just one missed payment for a mortgage, let alone the 345 days that this bill will add to. This bill adds 105 days roughly, making the foreclosure process in California about 345 days. Oftentimes, those are months that the borrower is not paying in their home. For a credit union, just one missed payment, let alone almost a year of missed payments, can hurt our ability to lend to small businesses. It hurts our ability to keep our capital levels at a safety and soundness level that our regulator is comfortable with. Like I said, we appreciate the recent amendments, and we're very familiar with the Nevada program. We were involved in that program, and the Nevada program has been extremely expensive, and that legislatures had to go back and sweep the funds at their equivalent of the Department of Financial Institutions to pay for this program. So they've taken away funds from the regulator, who at a time when credit unions and banks need their regulator more than ever to pay for this expensive program. So again, we are concerned about the timeline of foreclosure and how expensive the program will be. So for those, we remain opposed.
Thank you for your testimony. Others in opposition?
Scott Governor on behalf of California Financial Services Association in opposition.
Mira Girton on behalf of the California Chamber of Commerce, also in opposition.
Margaret Gladstein on behalf of the California Independent Bankers, also in opposition.
Joanne Betancourt representing SIFMA in opposition.
Are there others here in opposition to the measure? Okay, seeing none, it's the opportunity for the committee members to raise questions and make comments. I'd like to actually request that at least a couple of people on each side who are testifying in support or opposition join us back here, decide who you think those folks ought to be, because I think the committee, at least for my purposes, needs to hear more information and ask some questions. I don't know if there are others who are in support who wish to join Mr. Nava. Feel free to do that if you'd like. So I'm going to begin. Mr. Liu, actually, as a joint author of the measure, let me defer to you first, because I'm sure you have other things to add.
I'd like to hear from the green-lining person, if you're going to call some folks back.
Okay. Yeah, I was not intending to elicit further testimony. I was wanting to be able to have questions responded to. But Mr. Liu, I'll tell you what. If the gentleman from the Green Lining Institute wishes to say a brief word, not in response to a question, I'll allow that. If opponents wish to add anything further, I will allow that. But it has to be exceptionally brief and add something new to the discussion. Please.
The only comment I wanted to make is that we support this bill because it's a proactive approach, and we see it as being mutually beneficial to both parties.
Thank you very much. Is there anything further the opponents wish to add of similar length before we proceed to questions?
Mr. Chair, I just failed to mention that with respect to some of the folks who feel like there might be undue influence or fraud, we would very much encourage those folks to contact the functional regulators, whether it's Department of Corporations, Department of Financial Institutions, to have them investigate those improprieties.
All right, so let me begin with some questions. I think we all are exceptionally sensitive to the concerns, not only of the witnesses who testified, but others who couldn't be here today on whose behalf the co-authors, the joint authors, are seeking to act. Clearly there are people, we know this to be true, in our state who would have benefited from an attempt by their lenders or the entities who are servicing those loans to find some alternative to having them removed from their houses, if there's some way to modify, some way to work together. It's also the case, from what I can gather, and we all suffer from having relatively little time to evaluate this bill, which is why I want to have some opportunity for discussion now. It's also true that we know that there have been some successful efforts by some of in the banking industry and others to modify loans. We know this to be true as well. And so trying to figure out, what exactly we should be doing at this juncture. Foreclosures are beginning to decline, but there is this huge, I'll call it inventory or backlog of foreclosures where people are going to suffer tremendous loss. It's also true, from what I understand, that no lender really ultimately in this environment benefits from prematurely having a resident removed from their home because the value of the house has declined a great deal, and a short sale is not really to their benefit either. So there's a lot of incentives on all sides here to try to find some way to modify some of these loans. The question is this bill the vehicle to do that? And if so, what are its best elements? If there are problems, what are those problems? So I guess I'd like to ask the proponents first. Give me some statistics. Give me a sense as to the more than anecdotal information that we might have about the number of situations in which borrowers have been unsuccessful in seeking modifications because of recalcitrant lenders. Because really there is a difference, I think, between fraudulent statements made on behalf of a lender on the one hand, as the opponents point out, and efforts that have been less than aggressive by lenders in their situation to try to work things out. We know there is a big problem and that lenders have not done as much as they should. We know that to be true. Statistically, what do we know?
Yeah, the difficulty with the question is that there is no mechanism that records the result that you're asking. If there's anything to look to, it would be the foreclosures and then the sales. Because it isn't as though there's a separate category of data that is therein then set aside and stored that says these were people who contacted us, we were unable to work out an agreement, and so therefore the foreclosure sale continued. But it's not collected, it's not stored.
Yeah. I hesitate because I don't want to misstate the name of the entity and create problems, but I know there was at least one major lender about whom it was alleged they were not engaging sufficiently in meaningful efforts to modify loans to the great detriment of the borrowers. That I recall that discussion in the press throughout the last 6 months or so. Let me ask the proponents to respond to the opponent's critique of the Nevada situation. We have in the committee analysis, which because of the late referral had to be prepared basically by working all night. We have some statistics from Nevada, but we don't have much more in the way of evaluative information. The opponents have said, Mr. Nava, that the Nevada experience, I think the word was disaster or something like that. And I think that the committee analysis points out that there are some meaningful similarities in the home market in Nevada, between Nevada and California. What's your response to their critique?
Well, you've got on page 6 of the analysis, there is information regarding the notice of defaults filed, and then the request for mediation, and then the actual mediations that were conducted.
Right, but what do you know about the issue that was been raised regarding undue expense or a cumbersome process? Because clearly the authors of the bill don't wish this to be cumbersome or time-consuming that beyond what's necessary, because people will lose their houses, and no one wants that. So,
well, I think the way that Mr. Belote characterized it is probably fair, and that there is a difference of opinion. We had the Speaker of the Nevada Assembly who offered testimony as the author of the bill as to how the bill was structured, the progress that had been made, and that within significant quarters it was considered to be a success. You've got other, and I don't doubt that Mr. Belote had these conversations with people in Nevada who said, we don't like it, we don't think it works, it is expensive. Now, I think what we have done in this bill is learned from that process. Earlier amendments, as well as the amendments that were generated by the Judiciary Committee staff, I think go a long way towards containing the costs. The issue, I think probably the most significant amendment that I have seen is the one that makes this mandatory dispute resolution process unnecessary, is just the requirement that it won't apply to the lender if they've had a face-to-face meeting to discuss the loan. Bang, over, you're out.
And let me ask the opponents a question, and then I'll turn to other members of the committee. I have others, but I don't want to take too much time on my own. Is there really nothing about this legislation that you think is of any benefit here in the state? It seems to me that a good faith objective analysis of the status quo is that it is not successful, that there have been instances, perhaps a number of them, in which there have been loan modifications made, and people have been kept in their homes. But there have been legion stories, anecdotal to be sure, in the press about how unsuccessful the purely voluntary efforts undertaken thus far have been. Nothing about the bill is worth preserving?
Mr. Chair, in response to your question and also Mr. Nava's comments, there's no question that contact between borrowers and lenders is a good thing, and SB 1137, Senator Parada's bill, imposed that obligation. Now, I understand that if there is meaningful in-person contact, then the bill doesn't apply. So
correct.
So perhaps that's a meaningful amendment. So the concept of talking about it and seeing if, in fact, it's possible to make a modification is obviously a good thing. But the question is whether that should be imposed as a matter of statute.
Well, let's be clear, though. The bill, as proposed to be amended, as you point out, has two key elements to it from your standpoint, two protections from the opponent's standpoint. As you point out, one, if there's been that in-person discussion, the bill doesn't apply. Two, if that in-person discussion has been offered to a borrower, the bill doesn't apply. So therefore, the universe of borrowers to whom the bill applies is a universe that's rather confined. It's people who haven't been offered mediation or haven't taken it up. Why isn't that universe of people to whom, by definition, the lender has not effectively reached out in need of protection?
Well, then they probably are in violation of SB 1137 then. They're probably in violation of current law.
I'd like to ask Mr. Nava to respond and then turn to colleagues.
Well, I think what's significant about the proposed amendment that's on page 8, amendment number 1, is the way for the mortgagee, trustee, beneficiary, or other agent to avoid the mandatory process that we're talking about here is to have a face-to-face meeting for the purpose of discussing loan modification or foreclosure avoidance options. You don't even need to have the mediator, dispute resolution facilitator, whatever it is we want to call them, present. The issue that I'm trying to address through this legislation is one that exists repeatedly throughout this state. And I don't believe that people came up with these examples because they emailed each other. But over and over and over again, what we hear from people is, when I call in, I'm on hold till the line drops. When I call in, I talk to Mary. The next time I call in, I get to Joe.
And let me just interrupt for a second. I want to be clear of the committee's understanding of the Parada legislation. The legislation to which Mr. Belote refers requires telephonic rather than in-person communication, correct? So that is a meaningful distinction between the two approaches, just for the committee members. One is you got to get on the phone with somebody, and I think one needs to take into account the nature of the borrowers involved in these transactions as one evaluates whether telephonic communication is adequate. Mr. Nava, please continue.
Well, and then with the telephone contact, they don't have to actually make contact. Under 1137, you just document that you tried.
Well, I assume that would be true here, too.
Well, in this instance, it says you have to conduct a personal face-to-face meeting for the purpose of, all right?
Well, Mr. Belote says, just to be clear to the call, Mr. Belote says, what if they don't come? The bill says if it's been offered and it is not accepted, the bill does not have further requirements on the lender. Correct, Mr. Nava?
I'm absolutely, if it's not in here now, we'll do that. But you have to have the face-to-face. You have to be able to communicate and contact the borrower. Otherwise, there's absolutely no meaning to the issue of having a face-to-face conversation.
Colleagues? Mr. Monning, and then Mr. Tran.
First, I want to thank Mr. Nava for bringing this forward. I've requested to be a co-author. I'm particularly interested in this issue. In Monterey County, we've had over 10,000 foreclosures. In Santa Cruz County, over 5,000 foreclosures. And I'm looking at some of the proposed amendments. First, a concern as I look at the Nevada statistics, there's a high number, 30,000 who have received notices of default, 3,400 who've requested mediation, and only 372 conducted, 805 in the waiting line, it looks like. So out of 3,400 requests, 372 conducted, 800 in the waiting line. So that's just a concern about the administration that I think we need to learn more about. If we set something like this in motion, timeliness is going to be critical. And I think some of the proposed amendments help address some of those concerns. If there has been a face-to-face, you don't trigger this mediation process. The other concern I have, though, and I direct this question to the author, we talked some earlier today about this whole notion of mandatory mediation. It's kind of an oxymoron, but at the core of mediation is a voluntary process. We set this in statute. It does trigger obligations to bring people to the table. I think one of the questions, you have in Amendment 14 replacing mediation or mediator with facilitated resolution. And I'd just like to offer to work with you and opponents to explore what do we contemplate with facilitated resolution. And I think it's going to have to be clear to consumers, to borrowers. My concern is that we don't mislead people that this hearing is going to necessarily result in a favorable outcome for them. What it is an opportunity to share information and explore with a lender, is there a prospect for something other than foreclosure? In arbitration format, it would be a decision maker, and I don't know that the bill contemplates that either, but I think in exploring the different ADR avenues, we need to be clear exactly what's being offered the borrower and what the lenders are being brought into, so that people have a realistic expectation of what that process is designed to do. And so those are some of my concerns. May just kind of address some of those.
Yeah, and I think the committee staff agreed with you, because it makes sense to tie it back to an existing definition that has common language that everybody involved in the process can understand, rather than using the term mediation that could mean many things to many different people. So I think it's a good idea to tie it back to Civil Code Section 1375.
Thank you, Mr. Monning. Mr. Tran, followed by Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Nava. We had this bill in banking and finance, and thank you for taking some of the substantive amendments on this bill, which narrows it down on the issue. I have a couple of questions regarding the logistical outcome of this bill, and that is basically the bill calls for an administrator appointed or nominated by the governor and ratified by the Senate. What is the expected ramp-up or preparation time to get from the nomination to an administration of an office as such, a mediation office? And how many mediators are you looking at to deal with this issue?
Well, I think in terms of the appointment of the administrator, you're going to have people who have sufficient experience in the industry with borrowing and lending, so that they can actually offer some meaningful opinions. And as to the structure regarding the, I don't know whether we want to call them mediators or facilitators, there was a testimony by a representative of that particular industry who would give us some information about who are the people who would be qualified. And you would expect the administrator to come up with some minimum qualifications for people to participate in this, because if you're a mediator or facilitator on issues having to do with retail sales, probably not going to be terribly relevant with respect to real estate transactions and loans. So you'd want to have people who are competent in those respective areas so that they can be of real service.
Well, you're not responding to my question, if I may ask,
Sure.
as to the time. Time is of the essence here, because I think that will affect both parties, and I'm going to ask the opponents on that issue as well. How long would it take, as you estimate, from the time of nomination until the time of implementation of the program, given all the bureaucracy that we're going to have to set up to support this program?
Yeah, I can't really give you a time. I think that would just be speculative. Now, I don't contemplate that the processes that are in place currently would be suspended until such time as the administrator is named and the program put in place. I don't think that would be fair to the industry. And it certainly wouldn't be fair to anybody, the real estate market as well, communities. Sometimes when you want the foreclosures to move forward, if the family is incapable of renegotiating an appropriate sustainable measure, and you want to get those homes back out on the market. So I really can't give you
I appreciate
other than a guess, and I'm not going to do that.
I appreciate your candor on this. Time is of the essence, obviously, but based on the language of the legislation, from what I understood, tell me if I'm wrong, if it takes effect next year in January, then it basically mandates the lender to cease or to basically have a hold on any other types of proceedings other than mediation first, or a good faith attempt at mediation before foreclosure or short sales or any other types of activity.
That couldn't be, that wouldn't make sense. That other processes would be prohibited waiting for the system to be put in place. So if that's an issue, I'm perfectly happy to resolve that.
I see a lot of shaking on this side. I'm not sure if Mr. Gold might want to respond to that.
I appreciate the question. I think as we read the bill, it requires that once it's become effective, which hypothetically would be January 1, 2011, that any subsequent notice of default that's filed would have to allow the borrower to elect into this mediation, or whatever we're going to call it, facilitated resolution process. If that process hasn't been set up because the governor has to appoint and the Senate has to confirm, and that administrator has to take his role and then develop the program, find all the mediators to deal with the capacity. California is much bigger than Nevada, much more in terms of the number of notice of defaults, even those are declining. They would have to set up that program, train the mediators, get them ready to go, and until that point, you would have to sit before you could proceed with the foreclosure process.
Can I intervene just for a second and ask a question of the author for a moment? Mr. Nava, I take it you do not contemplate that scenario.
No.
And as a consequence, I assume that, and this is the problem with this process, this bill is subject to a rotten process. We have to move too fast, and this committee cannot make amendments on the fly. But I am going to ask anyway. I assume that you'd be receptive to an amendment to obviate the concern that Mr. Tran has just raised, because no one wants that to be the result. And that amendment might take the shape of something that says that the effective, the operative date of the requirements in this statute is contingent on a program that is already up and running and would be deferred until that time, something to that effect.
That's how I would, that would be an amendment I would contemplate, because that's the one that makes sense. It was never the intent to bring about a cessation of the already existing legal processes until the new one can be in place.
Mr. Belote, and then Mr. Tran, forgive me for interrupting. I don't want to interrupt the flow of your questions.
But
Mr.
in
Belote.
fairness, that requires a leap of faith on the part of industry that when the administrator says the system is up and going, it really is. And I'm not suggesting that the Nevada experience is perfectly analogous, but that system was allegedly up and going for a year. There, you couldn't proceed with the foreclosure until you got a certification from the mediator that the process had been concluded. And a year later, those certifications are just now beginning to dribble out. So saying the process is working and having it really work may not be the same.
One could imagine, and then Mr. Tran, please, one could imagine a process here, though, under which some state official certifies that the program is sufficiently in place to trigger the requirements of the legislation. If that was a concern, there's a way to address that. Mr. Tran, please, forgive me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No problem. We know that the bill provides for administrative fees and also for payments to the facilitator or mediator at $600. We did not get actually a number. I wonder if you were able to come up with a cost to set up a program like this, and also the cost for mediators just to set the support system.
No, that's still a work in progress. And let me address the issue with reference to the Nevada program. What they did in Nevada is different from what we're doing here. The Nevada program was a 2-page bill that essentially gave the responsibility to creating the program to the Nevada Supreme Court. And then the legislature backed away. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is to try to put as much language as possible, as much meat on the bones, so to speak, so that the process can be resolved through the legislature as much as possible, understanding that with any new program, you're going to have the administrator that has responsibilities and duties to flush out the rest of the issues in conversations with home representatives, with borrowers as well as lenders.
I have one last question, if I may, to the opponents, because having working on a number of these types of cases, actually, in the legal profession and dealing with lenders, if there is a prolonged or an undue prolonged session or process that you're going to have to sit down, and your representative's going to have to sit down and mediate and facilitate. This is non-binding, obviously. How would that affect the financial status or the decision on the part of the lender when the foreclosure process is at the end of the road? Would that makes it easier, or is it harder for the lender to take action if mediation is not successful?
Well, a message that we have communicated both in this House and the other House is that the non-judicial foreclosure process all operates on the principle of certainty. It's all in the civil code. It has to be done right, or there's going to be an action to enjoin the foreclosure, or there's going to be an action after the sale to void the trustee's sale. So what will happen, I assume, is you'll get right to the end of the process, and lawyers and trustees and lenders will have to get together and say, all right, are we safe to proceed or are we not? And if there are questions about that, questions about whether a title company would ensure the resulting sale of the house, for example, then they won't proceed and it will be delayed.
I guess from a financial perspective, though, what I'd like to know is, does it really help the borrower if, for example, if you're going to extend the whole process by 6 months or 9 months, how would the lender feel that if at the end of the day mediation's not successful?
Assemblymember Tran, let me try to take a crack at the response. I mean, I think some of the experience that we've had in Nevada is that, in fact, folks who are offered a trial modification set that aside because they think they might get a better outcome in a mediation session. What that does is it places them further in arrears. To the extent that the mediation program is elongated, that is going to increase the debt obligation. That is going to make it even more difficult to try to put them in a foreclosure alternative, to try to keep them in their home. I think there are elements of this bill, including the fee structure, that will definitely on a go-forward basis impact loan pricing, particularly if it also tells lenders that it's increasingly difficult for them to get their collateral back. I would also just say that I would recommend that the committee and others look at President Obama's program, look at the HAMP program, look at what's coming out from the federal regulators. There is documented outcomes, not just for foreclosures, but for foreclosure alternatives. Home retention, short sale, deed and lose, that's all well documented. It's not our numbers, it's the federal government's numbers. We can provide that to you if it's helpful. The federal program is also operating in such a way that they come out with directives. It doesn't require legislation. It is not necessarily a voluntary program. It's a contractual obligation between the federal government and the lender or servicer who enters into this arrangement. They then have to follow the guidelines of those particular programs. Their contact with the borrower is documented. The outcomes are documented. It's in the documents that the federal government provides on a monthly basis. So we would just offer that.
Thank you. Mr. Tran, anything further? Ms. Evans.
Can I just address one of the things that Mr. Tran brought up about the delay? Under the First Amendment that's on page 8, sub 2, the way for a lender to avoid, there's two ways for a lender to avoid participating in this program. First is to have a face-to-face meeting to discuss the loan, and secondly, documentation the borrower has been offered a beneficial loan modification. So in this legislation, if the borrower has been offered a loan modification, they don't get to game the system. They don't get to say, oops, never mind, I want to try to come out with a little better deal. Documented evidence that the borrower has been offered a beneficial loan modification designed to meet long-term sustainability.
Mr. Chair, if I could respond. I mean, I guess, one, we're looking at a particular concept. Let's set that aside and just stipulate to that. I guess the question would be, what would we be mediating then if a modification had been provided? Are we then mediating a short sale, or are we mediating a deed in lieu? I guess I'm confused. If a modification has been offered, then what the purpose of the mediation session is, because the alternative is going to be a short sale or a deed in lieu.
No. You don't have a mediation session if you've offered a loan mod.
Well, then
You're out of the game.
Okay. And Ms. Evans, just one clarifying question. You've been very patient. Just one clarifying question. The amendments to the Amendment 1 proposes that this law would not apply if there has been a face-to-face meeting or an offer of what is called a beneficial loan modification. What about the scenario in which the lender has offered a face-to-face mediation, but that's either been rejected or is pending? Should that element be added to that amendment?
Well, my sense is if you have a borrower who has been offered a face-to-face meeting, they've had contact, and they know about it, and they choose not to participate, this should not be available to them. They shouldn't be able to leverage the lender that way.
Ms. Evans, a soul of patience, you're up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mostly just want to make a couple of comments, and you might have some response. But first of all, this is a really difficult area to legislate in. Obviously, we've been struggling with this for well over a year, and different legislation has been brought forward to try to deal with this problem, and we obviously are still struggling with it. And one of the things I think, in my opinion, we need to do is to avoid unintended consequences and making things worse. And that leads me to the concern that I want to express, and that is some of the issues that have been raised by the credit unions. So far, the debate's been really focusing on the banks. The credit unions have provided information to the committee that they have already modified 80% of their delinquent real estate loans. So it appears to me, at least from that information, that they have a process that is working for both the credit unions and for the borrowers. So yet, even with the amendments that you're looking at that I assume would be taken at appropriations, is that right?
Correct, because they haven't been written yet.
Yeah. So they're not before the committee at this point. But even with those amendments being proposed, it hasn't removed their opposition to the bill. And I'm wondering what impact or how you see this going forward, because I want to make sure we're not meddling with a process that works.
Right. For the credit unions, because the universe of borrowers that they deal with tends to be smaller. And credit unions have a much, not only that, they have a much smaller pool of residential loans that they made. They didn't engage, for the most part, in the subprimes, and they don't have the same volume of loan problems that some of the other larger institutions have. And so if I were a credit union looking at this, and remember that these amendments were generated, my apologies, these amendments were generated probably last night around 11:30. Those credit unions that have contact and communication with their members and do the face-to-face meeting for the purpose of discussing loan modification, it's done. They're out. That borrower cannot invoke or request this process. So my feeling about what the bill does is, given the way that they do business, doesn't really apply to them because they tend to have these face-to-face communications.
That was my first reaction to it, too, but would the chair mind if the credit unions come forward and address their position on this? Yeah, because I looked at that, too, thinking that would probably exempt most of the problems, but perhaps you have a different view.
Sure, and the amendments are conceptual. We haven't seen exactly how they're going to look, to be fair. But we are worried about what Mr. Gould talked about, and that's that a borrower would sit on their hands and say, credit union modification, I'm not going to take that because I think I'm going to get a better deal with a mediator. And we think that this bill maybe encourages people to wait longer in their homes to go forward to a mediation, because it could be a better deal for them depending on if it's a mediator, an arbitrator, et cetera. And, you know, also to be fair, I don't think that the amendments address what we view as Safe Credit Union said is a $3,000 cost for every mediation. That's their lending department's analysis of the legislation. So the cost factor is still there. And they don't address the timeline that we talked about, that 2012, we think at a minimum this program will be up and running. And for the credit union world, we hope that we're out of the woods by then. So those are a couple of our concerns that we don't know if the amendments will get there.
Yeah, further, please.
Well, it just seems fair to say that at a minimum, there needs to be, from both of you, I'm hearing, that there has to be some mechanism whereby if you've made the good faith offer to have the face-to-face meeting, that's got to start a clock running as far as the borrower is concerned. So that's one thing that I think would have to be addressed. And I just want to mention that for my own part, I share these concerns. I do want to see what happens with the bill as it moves forward. I will vote to get it out of committee today to allow it to move forward, but I'll have to reserve my right to change my opinion later on.
Yeah, and Mr. Liu wishes to speak, and he's a joint author of the bill and needs to have his opportunity. I just want to ask one quick question, maybe a couple of our credit union representative here. First of all, if, again, there's no language yet, just a concept, and that makes it hard, and I get that. But I still understand the presentation included the possibility that a loan modification would have been offered, not accepted because one wants to see what happens. Are you saying would be offered during the period before the legislation actually takes effect? Is that the concern? Because once the legislation takes effect, that is no longer a problem. Is that the point?
That's the point. And again, I think conceptual. We don't know exactly how they're going to look. I think the amendments need some clarity. I don't think we know where they're going.
But just again, not to craft the whole bill while we're sitting here, but Mr. Nava, couldn't you envision, to obviate that concern, an amendment along the following lines, that to the extent that a loan modification is offered during the pendency of this process, before the law takes effect, but from May 2010 forward, that modification preempts an entity from being subject to this legislation, even if it happened? You can imagine that kind of a structure that would preclude the concern from being realized, right?
Sure, but what about the case where the financial institution, usually a credit union, would look at someone's financials before NOD, see that they're in trouble, and know that, wow, under our waterfall scenario, this person's not going to qualify for a loan modification. So we know right off the bat that, they're missing their car payment. We haven't seen them in the credit union lately. They're just not going to qualify, although we'd still have to run them through the mediation process.
And Mr. Chair, she did a much better job articulating my confusion, which is, with the amendments, if they're ineligible for a loan modification, is the purpose of the mediation then to figure out whether they're going to be a short sale or a deed in lieu? I guess I'm curious as to the purpose of the mediation session.
Mr. Nava, briefly, and then Mr. Luz.
Yeah, let me go back.
I'm sorry, Ms. Brownlee.
Let me go back to the conceptual language.
Sorry.
If, for example, in your instance, in the credit union instance, you've looked at the person, you see that they're going to be in trouble, you have a face-to-face meeting to discuss the loan modification, you're not involved. That's out. That's your get out of mediation card. It's the same way for any of the lenders. If you have a face-to-face meeting, then if the borrower, after the face-to-face meeting, says, I want mediation, and you've already had your face-to-face, they don't get one.
Okay. All right, Mr. Nava, thank you. Mr. Belote has a quick comment, and then, with great apologies to Ms. Brownlee, she's up.
I know she's entitled to ask the questions, not me, but does the bill, in your view, establish a substantive right or a substantive obligation to offer a modification?
Not if they don't qualify. There are going to be some people we know who there's nothing you can do to make them eligible for a modification.
Does the bill establish a substantive obligation to offer a modification to someone who qualifies? Or does a lender have a substantive right to say, we don't do modifications? And I think that's a very key legal question.
And I think it's fair to say that you can answer if you want, Mr. Nava, and then Ms. Brownlee, it is her turn to ask the questions or make the comments for that matter.
That's why I don't know. I haven't been eating that many meals out of aluminum pans. But looking at Amendment 1, it doesn't say that you have to offer a modification. It says that you have to have a face-to-face meeting for the purpose of discussing the modification. And then it says, or. You have documented evidence that you've offered a mod.
The only reason I ask, Mr. Chair, is that there is presently litigation coming out of the legislation we've already enacted, which suggests that there is a substantive obligation to offer a modification. That you don't have the right to say, I'm sorry, at that face-to-face meeting, we don't do modifications.
I want Ms. Brownlee to be able to speak her piece. It is conceivable that there would be an amendment to this legislation that makes clear that that obligation is not placed on the lender, and Mr. Nava appears to be saying that that would be an amendment that he would accept because it's not his intent, correct?
Yeah, I don't think...
Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank the author for bringing this issue forward. I think one area that we do have agreement on is that there are, while we don't have the data that the chair was asking for, but we do hear issues from our constituents, and we read about articles in the newspaper about issues like this, that people cannot get loan modifications and lose their home through foreclosure. But the question is, how can we solve it, or at least narrow the pool of people who would be victim to that? And I guess in the conversation and the debate that we're having right now, I'm not sure that I understand if we were going to move in the direction of making these amendments the way the conversation is going right now. The gentleman who testified here today, the gentleman who testified first, it sounded to me as though he said that he was in a trial modification. He didn't make, or that was alleged to have not made a third payment, and his modification was revoked. And so I'm not sure, based on the conversations that we're having right now, how his issue would be resolved.
That's correct.
It would not be resolved.
That's correct. I mean, under the conceptual amendments before us today, if he was offered a loan modification, he would not be eligible for the program that's set up here.
Well, see, I see that as a problem because assuming someone has gone created a trial modification in good faith and has made their payments, and we can debate whether his payment was on time or a few days late. Regardless, the payment has come in. But by virtue of the interpretation that his payment was a few days late, without looking at his financials, he no longer has the option for a modification, while his financials would demonstrate that he could. The gentleman's paying $5,400 in mortgage for $2,500,000. Yeah, thank you.
A lot of money.
Oh. So, it seems like, if I was going to err on who's got the best deal here, I'm going to err on the side that the lender has the better side of that particular deal. But yet, he's paying. So, I'm concerned about the good faith borrower with a well-intentioned who has the right financials but still not having the opportunity to continue in his loan modification.
Ms. Brownlee, I would respectfully suggest that is a problem you will never solve. Every modification is going to have terms, and the borrower is going to have to comply with the terms. If they don't comply with the terms, they're in violation of the obligation, and a foreclosure is legally possible. And if there's a debate about whether they've complied with the obligation, they should seek an injunction against the
Mr. Bloat, I'd ask you to defer to Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, and I hear that, but I think that maybe if we took it another step forward to say if we could look at each case in sort of an individual manner, it could be indeed a win-win both for the lender and for the borrower by virtue of whether it's a formal dispute resolution, mediation, so forth and so on. But if the parties were able to sit down and actually work through something, that it could be win-win. In this particular case, if everything that the testimony was true in this particular case, by talking through it, I think it could be win-win for both the borrower and the lender.
Assemblymember Brownlee, if I can just respond maybe to some of the concerns that you've received from your constituents, and I'll make this short. The changes that are happening at the federal level try to resolve the customer experience. They get to the issue of borrowers not having an answer and the foreclosure process moving notwithstanding. Part of the recent changes that came down require that borrower who is requested a modification to receive an answer. They get a very detailed non-approval notice, which in detail explains why they are considered ineligible. The process is halted, and there's a 30-day period whereby the borrower can request the lender or servicer reconsider. So some of, we too have heard about the customer experience, and we think, based upon the changes to the Obama proposal, the HAMP program, that those elements are being addressed, and they're being addressed at a rapid pace.
Thank you. One more question. And in this conversation, we talk about the lender or the servicer, and sometimes there can be both. Is that not correct?
Yeah, typically it's going to be the servicer. For the most part, most of the mortgages in the universe are not held within the lender's portfolio. The lender has sold those off into the secondary market. Secondary market can be anybody. It can be a state pension program. It can be anybody. Part of why you do that is because if you don't have the loans in your portfolio, you can continue to provide home ownership opportunities. So a servicer can be a bank. It can be a non-bank. The servicer is basically the one authorized by the owner of the note, CalPERS, a foreign government, to transact the business between the owner and the borrower. They're collecting the money. They're making sure that the owner gets it. They're also generally put in charge in case there's a circumstance of default.
Well, a year or two ago, I carried a bill on servicer reform that Mr. Nava and Mr. Belote both know about. In some cases with the servicer, there can be malfeasance with the servicer, which then triggers foreclosure as well by virtue of a servicer potentially collecting the payment but not applying that payment back to the principal of the mortgage and then putting the money in his or her own pocket, but yet the borrower continues, to cascade into this foreclosure situation too. So under a circumstance like that, bringing the parties together. Again, I don't think this is the intent of the bill. It's to figure out a loan modification. But in that process, if we were able to surface malfeasance on the part of the servicer, then that might also be a form of trying to figure out a better modification to show that to actually have the payments that the borrower is making go towards the principal of their mortgage.
To your point, Assemblymember, there were changes made to the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. I remember your bill. And the RESPA changes did address, and they apply to all mortgages. They do address the payment and when it's credited and those kind of disputes. So, and we'd be happy to share those with you, those recent changes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Liu.
Sure. I just want to make the point that nothing in this bill is new. It's been tried before in other jurisdictions. Some have done better than others. In Connecticut, I think it has a success rate of over 75%. Philadelphia and Cleveland, I think over 50% success rates in mediations. And we have the benefit of seeing what other jurisdictions did and then learning from that. In addition, after their amendments committed to today, this is a far less aggressive bill than any of these other jurisdictions because a lender now can simply avoid mediation altogether. They just do one of two things. Either they have a face-to-face meeting or they offer a beneficial loan modification. So this is not, I think, the same bill that came out of banking after the amendments are taken. I just want to make that point. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a couple or three concluding comments, and then we're going to vote. It's actually been, I think, a very constructive conversation. I appreciate all the committee members participating in that. These are not necessarily related points. One thing I believe to be the case, if the bill were properly amended, that the existence of the bill, not its operation, the existence of the bill could precipitate, we'll call it voluntary action in the meantime, on a much more accelerated basis as lenders seek to avoid the requirements of the bill. And that itself might be beneficial because it would lead to more interpersonal contact about these loans in the meantime. One might ask whether that's really true. Won't the market just take care of that? And one quick thought I have is, when the home prices were declining so precipitously, during that period, in particular, lenders had a very strong incentive to try to modify loans because a short sale was going to be of increasingly little benefit to them. We are now seeing a reversal in that trend. Home prices are beginning, in some cases dramatically, to increase again. As those home prices increase, the incentives, the purely economic incentives that lenders might have to intervene aggressively to preserve the loan begin to diminish because the return they could get on the sale begins to increase. Just a thought. I want to share some of the concerns about credit unions here. I think it's important to recognize that there's wheat and chaff in this discussion. I think the bill, as it was drafted originally, failed to recognize that. I am concerned about how it can we can effectively structure the latter of the two elements of the First Amendment, the beneficial loan modification piece, because if that phrase was literally loan modification and that's all, you would incentivize lenders to offer crummy modifications to get out of the ambit of the loan. The term beneficial is going to be a term in the eye of the beholder unless we can, through some linguistics I'm not capable of doing on the fly here, narrow its focus so that an objective assessment could be made. One does not want subjective criteria in the bill. One wants objective criteria with a bill to move forward. I want to say this too. I am concerned. I think the opposition has made an important point, although in passing, and that is, depending upon how elaborate this structure is, you could see increases, I'll say artificially injected into the mortgage market by virtue of this. I don't know by what magnitude, but something could change broadly rather than pertaining to the narrower universe of people who require loan modifications. Anybody seeking a loan might see some increase, and that would be bad in the state. We're trying to move in just the opposite direction. We just extended a home buyer's credit, for example. If loans were to increase by some magnitude, it would obviate the benefit of that legislation. So, having said all that, just speaking for myself, because I'm, as you can tell, contending as we're dealing with it, with the details of this bill, I think my position is fairly close to that of Ms. Evans, which is, I think that there is a clear need, especially given the escalating home prices that we're seeing now, for a bill that hits on these cylinders for some people. Something additional to what the market is putting in place has to happen. I am concerned regarding unintended consequences, which could be many. Given the timing of our deadlines, we cannot button all these things down in this committee. I will support moving the bill forward with not only the amendments that are in writing, but those things that I've mentioned, among others, today. And I, as Ms. Evans, may well vote against the bill later on, depending upon the success with which that wordsmithing happens, and depending upon not merely the opponent's representations, but an objective assessment as to what this might do to the loan market generally. So, having said that, any further questions or comments from members of the committee? Mr. Nava, do you wish to close?
Yeah, I also agree that the conversation has been beneficial. And I think we've made significant progress in part because of input by the industry and some extraordinary heavy lifting by committee staff and the chair as well. And so I think we're closer now, certainly, than we were. When was that? Monday? whatever day of the week that was. And so every time we have one of these kumbaya meetings, we get a little closer. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to get to a point. I'm not sure that we'll have industry support, but I do think that we're going to significantly address the overwhelming majority of the concerns and criticisms that we're hearing.
And I think it's clear, I can infer from the comments made, that the majority of the committee members are feeling two things. First, a tremendous amount, not just of sympathy with people who find themselves in this marketplace as we're talking about it now, but also a real desire to concretely, not just have the pretense of, but concretely benefit them, balanced by the very legitimate concerns that the opponents have raised today, not only about unintended consequences on a small scale, but on a broad scale, requiring tremendous heavy lifting in the future on this bill. Mm-hmm. Having said that, call the roll. Oh, is there a motion on the bill?
Because of the modifications on this bill, I'll move it.
Ms. Bradley's been waiting to say that for half an hour. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Call the roll.
Fear?
Aye.
Fear, aye. Tran? No. Tran, no. Brownlee? Brownlee, aye. Evans? Evans, aye. Hagman? Torlakson? Torlakson, aye. Knight? Knight, no. Lou? Lou, aye. Monning? Monning, aye. Nava? Nava, aye.
Okay, that bill is out. With great gratitude to all the participants today, the committee members, and all the witnesses, we are adjourned. Yeah, I know.